All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I and many others been waiting a long time to for this to come, both the book and also for you guys to be here in attendance. It's an amazing pleasure to have not just one, not just two, not just three, but all four of the co-authors of the new book, Mobilizing for Elections, Patronage and Political Machines in Southeast Asia, here with us today in Michigan. So Derek Groom, thanks so much for organizing all of this and bringing this all together. It's a real accomplishment. Anyone who works on Southeast Asia knows just how much accumulated knowledge, expertise we have in the room today. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the four co-authors and say a few words. I'm just to keep things brief because they've got extremely illustrious careers of scholarship. I'm just going to introduce them by their title and by their most recent book, at least most recent before they all co-authored Mobilizing for Elections. So Edward Aspinall is a professor in the Department of Political and Social Change in the Coral Bell School for Asia Pacific Affairs at Australian National University. His most recent book before this is Democracy for Sale, Elections, Clientelism, and the State in Indonesia. Paul Hutchcroft is also professor of political and social change in the Australian National University's Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, of which he was the founding director. And his most recent book before this was Strong Patronage, Weak Parties, The Case for Electoral System Redesign in the Philippines. Alan Hicken is professor of political science here at the University of Michigan, where he is also an affiliate with Center for Political Studies, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and yes, WCED. And his most recent book was Electoral Dynamics in the Philippines, Money Politics, Patronage, and Clientelism at the Grassroots. And Meredith Weiss is professor of political science in the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany, SUNY. And she most recently wrote The Roots of Resilience, Party Machines, and Grassroots Politics in Southeast Asia. So just one sort of brief thing to say before we kick things off. All four of these scholars are really renowned scholars of comparative politics writ large. They all contribute mightily to our theoretical understanding of massively important topics in comparative politics as a whole. They're all also extremely renowned as scholars of Southeast Asia writ large. So all of them have spent long careers writing about the region as a whole, not only specific cases. But despite that, I would also say that you will not find four more esteemed experts on the particular cases on which they know best. You cannot find a better expert on Malaysia than Meredith Weiss. You will not find a bigger expert on Thailand than Alan Hicken. You'll not find someone who knows more about Indonesian politics than Ed Aspinall, and you will not find a more illustrious scholar of the Philippines and more knowledgeable scholar of the Philippines than Paul Hutchcroft. So the fact that the four of them, with the kind of knowledge they have accumulated, have come together on a project is remarkable. We've been really looking forward a long time to seeing the final product. And it's really, really exciting to me. And I know a lot of people in the room to have them all here. So I won't take up more time, but we're thrilled you're here and looking forward to the session and to the Q&A. So thanks, guys.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that very generous introduction. I think we're all deeply honored to be here and want to say that we are equally delighted to finally be able to visit the Weiser Center. I was saying last night that my last time to give a talk at Michigan was to the Southeast Asia Center in 1998. So it's great to be back, and thanks for hosting us. Thanks, Derek, for all you've done to make the arrangements. It's just wonderful to be able to join you here and to be able to talk with you today about our book, Mobilizing for Elections. Just to give a little background on how this project came to be, we are all avid observers of elections in our countries of core specialization, as highlighted by Dan already, noting that Alan also has an additional very substantial corpus of work on the Philippines as well. And as scholars of comparative politics, we are also very interested in, well, comparison and seeing how patterns that we see within our countries of core specialization play out in other places. Just speaking for myself and teaching comparative politics, I was always struck at how the term money politics is used in such different ways, from the Philippines to Indonesia to Japan, onward and onward into different settings, including the United States. And so we came into this with very strong interests. Would note that Alan had already written very extensively on clientelism. I had written on the importance of differentiating between the terms clientelism and patronage, and among different types of patronage. And then we also had the concurrent projects that Dan mentioned that led to Ed's co-authored book on clientelism, co-authored with Ward Barenshot on clientelism in Indonesia, and Meredith's work on party machines in Malaysia and Singapore, both of the latter published by Cornell Press. So with the support of the Australian Research Council, as well as at various points from the Center for Democratic Institutions at ANU, as well as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we embarked on this project. So this is the product, of course. And as we were getting into it, as I've said, we knew that the term money politics is ubiquitous the world over, but what does it mean? How does it vary? What are its components, and why does it matter? And towards the end, we saw this particularly beautiful illustration of money politics. This is Chavit Singson up in the northern Philippines, who invented a money gun and was shooting 100 peso bills out of that to some very eager constituents. But we must also remember that there is major opposition to money politics. This is a poster that we found in Malaysia, Reject Money Politics, from our observation of the 2013 election. So our goals were, first of all, to understand different forms of patronage that candidates, parties, and campaigners deliver to voters and to other supporters. And when we look at patronage, we wanted to go beyond the usual focus just on the relationship between politicians and voters, and look at a much broader political ecosystem of patronage as it can flow, just looking at the Philippines context, all the way from the presidential palace down through different levels of government to the village level. Then we're interested in what sort of political networks through which patronage is distributed. And that led us into this third question, which we put together the networks and the types of patronage. And this led to our basic concept, which we're going to be telling you more about today, of electoral mobilization regimes. Then we want to know how these things actually work. How and to what extent do they influence voters? Recognizing that patronage is not the full story. That's our focus, but it's not the full story of how voters make their decisions. And finally, how can we be political scientists without having an explanatory framework? So what explains the patterns that we observe both across and within countries? And here we focus, as we'll be getting into, on historical institutional factors, electoral system design, which has its own historical stickiness to it as well, and also patterns of the degree to which politicians have discretion in dispensing state resources, politicians relative to bureaucrats in particular. So, as you all probably know, there's a rich literature on patron-client relations already in Southeast Asia, going back to the work of Carl Lande on the Philippines and James Scott on patron-client ties across Southeast Asia. Jim Scott was our lead discussant a few days ago at the Asian Studies Conference. He mischaracterized his important work from 69 to 72 as slapdash and said everything I learned was from Carl Lande. We would say that we owe a debt of gratitude to both of them, and we're happy to draw him back into this realm. Since then, there has been a wealth of literature on other regions, from Japan to India to Africa to Latin America, you name it. Our goal is to draw on that literature as well as those historical foundations in Southeast Asia and refocus attention on Southeast Asia while contributing to larger comparative debates. And Ed, in a second, will be getting into what we see our major contributions to be. So one starting point that we have in looking at this project is to disentangle patronage and clientelism, which are often treated as synonymous, but we do not think that they should be. For example, in the literature in Japan, I think there's a bit of conceptual confusion because there is not this sort of differentiation. So in our analysis, drawing from the work of Martin Schefter, patronage is a material resource, benefits usually from public sources for political support or party advantage. You have to go deep into his footnotes to find this definition, but that's what we're starting with. Then clientelism, and this draws on the work of Lande and Scott and others, a personalistic relationship of power between patrons of higher social status linked to clients, face-to-face enduring ties, contingency of reciprocity, can vary in content purpose over time. Should be familiar to many of you. So therefore, we speak of patronage resources and flows and clientelist networks, linkages, and ties, and highlight that not all patronage involves clientelism because a lot of clientelism is impersonalistic, oriented towards, for example, entire congressional districts or parliamentary constituencies. And not all clientelism involves patronage. So the classic clientelistic ties between landlord and peasant that may or may not work out to have important significance in the electoral realm. So our research focus is three primary countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We wanted to have Thailand in there, but this coup thing got in the way. So we had plans for a beautiful royal flush: Malaysia 2013, Indonesia 2014, Thailand 2015, Philippines 2016. But the 2014 coup got in the way. So that relegated Thailand to a secondary case, along with Singapore, drawing very much on Meredith's very extensive work there, and Timor-Leste. We had multiple collaborators in each country. We also partnered with universities in each of our three major cases. And these are the list of elections that we looked at, as well as Pilkada in Indonesia, Indonesian elections 2019, Philippines 2013, but the core elections would, of course, be Malaysia 2013, Indonesia 2014, Philippines 2016. I was unfortunately, no, not unfortunately, but I happened to be working with the Australian Embassy in the Philippines through many of these years from 2013 to 2017. So I missed all the fun in Indonesia, but I have sort of vicariously picked up some of the key lessons from my colleagues on that. So our methods involve what we call extensive ethnographic research with big teams averaging around 50 researchers in each country, with, of course, careful training sessions for them to make sure that they are all aware of the key goals, and give them some tips on shadowing candidates, interviewing, observing election events. And the four of us also traveled through each country for interviews and observation. For me, Indonesia, at other points, not for that election. Then we complemented that with national surveys, including survey experiments, local broker and voter surveys using vote buying lists, and individual interviews and focus group discussions. We estimate that there were a total of some 3,000 interviews that went into this project. And it's a project that has yielded lots of intermediate outputs along the way before this culminating volume came out. So core books on Malaysia to the left, electoral dynamics, Indonesian electoral dynamics translated into Indonesian, and electoral dynamics in the Philippines, supplemented by the work that Meredith and Arnold Puyot did on electoral dynamics in Sarawak, a special issue on Pilkada. Two colleagues in the Philippines, Julai Tihanki and Cleo Kalimbahin, came out with a companion volume on patronage democracy in the Philippines. And in my time working with the aid program in the Philippines, I was involved in a public education project on the virtues of electoral system redesign, basically trying to change the topic from cockamamie idea of Philippines going federal, but that's another story. So that's all from me, and I will turn it over to Ed, as I said, to highlight our contributions and more.
Thank you very much, Paul. And remember one very important thing. And let me add my thanks to Michigan, to Dan, to Derek for organizing this wonderful event today. It's great to be here. So just to highlight some of the things that we think are the major contributions of this volume. Of course, ultimately, it's up for others to judge, but just to run through them. One of the things we try to do in the volume is to show how the patterns of patronage distribution and the networks through which patronage flows are mutually constitutive, that they clump together in these sort of syndromes that we label electoral mobilization regimes. Then we develop a kind of a causal argument to explain why we find distinctive electoral mobilization regimes in our different core countries. And to do that, we look at historical institutional factors. So we look at processes of state building, party development, over the long term, development of bureaucracy in particular, and how these combine in distinctive ways to produce these distinctive electoral mobilization regimes. Thirdly, we want to challenge conventional understandings of the sort of the meanings and motivations that lie behind clientelistic politics. We distinguish among different types of patronage. Paul has already started to get us in this direction, but we argue that we can think of patronage in terms of micro-particularism, meso-particularism, and macro-particularism, where micro refers to individual gifts that politicians and parties distribute to voters at election time. Not only at election time, but typically at election time. So often coming in the form of what's typically known in the literature as vote buying, so distribution of cash, or other minor gifts such as cooking, food stuff, clothing, household items. Those sorts of gifts are particularly prominent in Indonesia and the Philippines amongst our core cases. Meso-particularism, in contrast, refers to what we often think of as pork barrel politics. So these are gifts or benefits that are distributed to groups. These could be communities, repairs to a village road, for example, but they could also be gifts to community organizations or NGOs or social groups. So for example, a new sound speaker for a house of worship would be a typical example. Macro-particularism is what we refer to as the hijacking of programmatic politics. So this might be the case, for example, where we see a national program, for example, to distribute scholarships to school children is hijacked for particularistic purposes by politicians. And we'll be coming back to this later in the presentation. Fifth, we explore the ways in which patronage politics interact with identity and group politics. And finally, we explore not only this distinction amongst electoral mobilization regimes as they differ across countries, but we also look at variation within countries as well, so subnational patterns of variation. Just to make the point, the caveat, I suppose, that we do acknowledge that elections in Southeast Asia are not exclusively about patronage. We don't mean to make that sort of claim. You can see a picture of Duterte there, for example. So these other sorts of appeals definitely do feature in Southeast Asian elections to varying degrees and in varying ways. So this poster of an education program being offered by the Fretilin Party in Timor-Leste, for example, is a typical example of programmatic politics. So we're certainly not making the claim that Southeast Asian elections are exclusively about patronage. Just as we identify three different types of patronage, macro, meso, and micro, we also identify three types of mobilizational networks, which are sort of ideal types that we find associated with the three core countries. Party machines, which dominate in Malaysia, local machines, which are characteristic of politics in the Philippines, and ad hoc teams or ad hoc networks in Indonesia. So let's go through these very briefly. So in the Malaysian case, and this was really striking for me as someone who'd come from from Indonesia to observe in Malaysian elections. You just see this on the sort of the Malaysian streetscape when you visit Malaysia at election time, especially on the peninsula. Masses of party flags, party colours, relatively little images of individual candidates, especially of local candidates, reflecting the fact that elections in Malaysia are very much dominated by national or regional party organisations, in which parties strategically determine the allocation of patronage. And through these parties, individuals can develop long-term, lifelong careers and commitments. Access to state resources is key in terms of distribution of patronage, with dominant parties dominating government and therefore being able to hijack state resources for distribution. So therefore we see this primary reliance on meso and macro forms of patronage, so pork barrel politics, hijacking of or manipulation of national programs, relatively little of that micro level vote buying and individualized distribution that is so characteristic of the other two countries, reflecting the fact that we have these large coordinating bodies, i.e. parties, that dominate and dominate the political landscape, monopolize state resources and can distribute them. In the Philippines, by contrast, almost a sort of an intermediate case, politics is very much built around local machines. So these are machines often at the city or municipal level. So these are machines that are built around individual politicians, often relying on family networks, very famously, of course, in the Philippines case. But they can retain power for long periods, even for across several generations, certainly across decades. Teams are similar in structure to the Indonesian teams I'll be describing in a moment. So these typical sort of clientelistic pyramids, which reach right down to the neighborhood level. But distinctively, these networks, these local machines tend to endure across elections, which makes them quite different from the Indonesian system. We see a lot, in contrast to Malaysia, we see a lot of that micro level particularism, vote buying, and so on. Beg your pardon?
Micro plus meso.
Right, micro plus meso, right? But also a heavy reliance on public resources, as these local machines often capture government at the local level, as I said, often for the long term, and are able to monopolize control over local resources. In the Indonesian case, we see some similarities to the Philippines, but in this case, there's much less coordination among candidates. So in the Philippines case, candidates typically run as a slate. So candidates running for relatively minor positions often get support from the head of the local machine and can rely on state resources in funding their campaigns. In the Indonesian case, more often than not, candidates are pretty much on their own. They have to assemble the teams themselves, they have to fund them themselves, and they have to recruit the members of them individually. And typically the way this happens is that a candidate will divvy up their electoral district into, sub-districts, villages, and so on. They'll appoint some of their friends to head their subsidiary teams in each of these areas. And those friends will then recruit their own friends or relatives or members of the same organization, and so on down the chain. So you can get these really massive teams. They're typically called Tim Sukses in Indonesia, success teams. They have a lot of names, actually. But you can see that through this process of recruitment, you get these sort of really attenuated links, which can link the grassroots brokers up to the candidate at the apex. So the result is that in reality, there's a lot of people who might not even know, or let alone support the candidate, who end up working for them. So there are these big problems about loyalty and shirking. For example, when money is distributed down these pyramids to distribute to voters, a lot of it will go missing because these individuals don't really expect a lot from their candidates. The other characteristic of these machines, these success teams, is that they tend to be ephemeral. Because they're massive, because the candidates are raising their own money to establish and form them, they tend to last only for the election. Sure, if the candidate gets elected, they might make a bit of an effort to reward the core team members with jobs, contracts, that sort of thing, but they won't typically have much ability or interest in rewarding everyone. People are in it for the duration of the election, and after that, it's goodbye. Now, I won't try and explain this whole thing, but the point is here to show that the electoral mobilization machines, which we identify at the top here, the party machines of Malaysia, local machines of the Philippines, ad hoc teams of Indonesia, tend to cluster with particular types of patronage distribution. So for example, the fact that we get relatively little micro-particularism in Malaysia reflects the fact that it's parties, and parties that are embedded and are able to capture state power that do the distribution that run election campaigns in Malaysia. Individual candidates don't have the resources or the motivation to fund their own individual vote buying efforts. Rather, they're able to rely on the pork barrel politics, the meso-particularism, and the captured programs that their parties are able to offer them. Why the differences? So this is where we turn to a historical institutional explanation, and we ask the questions such as when and how did elections and parties develop, and in particular, when did they develop in relation to the development of strong state bureaucracies, and how enduring were these elections and parties? So starting with the Philippine example, because it's particularly illustrative, I think. Under American colonial rule, very famously, elections came first before the development of a strong bureaucracy. These elections were introduced first at the municipal, then to the provincial and national levels, and a powerful national bureaucracy never really emerged, partly because it was foreclosed by the dominance over local power that was established by the local strong families that were able to capture a power at the local level through this early introduction of elections. So this strong basis of elite power at the local levels led to the emergence of local machines without strong parties developing into the post-independence era. And this system has basically dominated the Philippines, therefore, ever since. Indonesia is quite a contrasting case. We saw the colonial bureaucracy collapsing, or certainly being very severely weakened at the time of the revolutionary transition to independence. Patronage-based parties began to develop in the 1950s, and had that development continued uninterrupted, we perhaps would have seen a system emerging that was comparable to that we saw in Malaysia, perhaps with more competition, but nevertheless strongly party-based forms of patronage. But we know this system was foreclosed by the transition to authoritarianism from the mid-1960s onwards, and the marginalization of political parties from political life thereafter. The bureaucracy became all dominant in Indonesian politics, but it wasn't a sort of Weberian, effective administrative state. It was very much a patronage machine itself. So patronage distribution became centered and centralized through the bureaucracy. This legacy still limits elected politicians in Indonesia today. We can in some ways, we can read post-Suharto politics as a series of efforts, sometimes successful, sometimes less successful, by elected politicians to try to wrest control over patronage resources from these these networks which are deeply embedded within the state. And the result is that elected politicians in Indonesia just don't have the sort of dominance over budgetary sources of patronage that we see in the other two countries. Malaysia and party-based patronage is a different story again, where we saw a bureaucracy emerging first in the colonial period, but then a strong party or a coalition, more strictly speaking, capturing power in the years leading up to independence. This party controlling dispensation of patronage right up until very recently. So hence this highly party-centered form of patronage politics we see in that country. let me hand over to Alan.
Okay, so so we spent a good deal of time in the book looking at this thing called microparticularism. So these are, as Ed mentioned, these are the hands out to voters, prayer mats, foodstuffs, sometimes bags of rice, cash is the probably most common. The key is these are given to individuals or households. So these are very micro targeted. Often, not always, but often during the campaigns. And these were ubiquitous in Indonesia and the Philippines, much less common in Peninsular Malaysia, although we do see some of these behaviors in Sabah and Sarawak. This is the stuff that gets a lot of press condemnation, gets a lot of attention during election time. And we were quite surprised initially that there's very little social stigma. So we expected to kind of have to back into these things and ask all kinds of interesting ways to kind of get people to be truthful about this stuff. Much to our surprise, at least initially, many candidates, brokers, voters would talk very openly about these activities, which led to some really great conversations over our field work. For example, one day we were meeting with a candidate for mayor, deputy mayor in Sorsogon province. And as we chatted, brokers were sort of streaming in and out of this little compound, picking up bags or packages of noodles to distribute with cash on election day. And he made a big point to show us, to tell us that these were the fancy Chinese noodles, not the cheap Filipino noodles. That was very important. But as we sat there, he took the time to sort of give us a primer on best practices. On how to give money to voters. So in the Philippines, typically what you do is you take the money and you staple it to a ballot, or attach it to a letter and a sample ballot that then is given to voters. So he showed us the first one here, made it a little hard to see there. All of these had cash on them. They were about 300 pesos, so about $5-6 US dollars. He showed us this first one and said rookie mistake, right? The person, first of all, is just using they're stapling the money on top of each other, so it looks like it's not very much, and they staple on the back. The sample ballot. Really dumb. You can't see the person's name. You want that name association with the cash. So he showed us another one from another rival candidate. Better, stapled on the front this time. So you can actually, you kind of blurred out so you can't see the name, but it's there, but they still didn't fan the money, right? So you got 300 peso notes stacked on top of each other. It doesn't visually look very appealing. Of course, the best one was his right here. The notes fanned very nicely across. You can see it's a big chunk of money, and then his name's right here, right next to the money, big bold vote for me. Lots of stories about that, including another candidate who offered to randomize his vote buying if we would pay for the campaign. We decided not to do that. But these kinds of things are really, these kinds of hands are really common in comparative politics, in comparative elections. And one of the things we're really interested in is, what do these things represent? What do voters think they're getting? What do candidates think they're giving? How should we think about these things? And there's a pretty standard view in comparative clientelism that's kind of developed over time. And that's these things represent contingent targeting with an implicit expectation, or sometimes explicit expectation, of reciprocity. So I'm giving you money, and the expectation is you're going to vote for me. And there is some either implicit or explicit promise of monitoring and enforcement if that exchange breaks down, right? If I don't show up to vote, or if I vote for the wrong candidate, I have some way of figuring that out. And there's lots of literature and ink been spilled about how you manage to do that with a secret ballot. And this can come in different forms: vote buying when you're targeting voters who are uncertain, a turnout buying when you're targeting your core supporters, or just trying to get them out to election day to vote, and then abstention buying, where you target your opponent's supporters and get them to stay home. And we saw some examples of all of these in our cases, but much less than we imagine. Instead, what we argue is that much of the behavior that scholars and commentators treat as contingency-based clientelism is really actually not contingent at all. Instead, when candidates distribute payments to voters or to groups, they're frequently engaging in other activities, things we call credibility buying, turf protection, and brand building. These are primarily non-contingent strategies that are common, they're rational, and they're viable. So the first of these is brand building. These are non-targeted distributions meant to increase name recognition and to signal generosity. Right, so this is, and these are, again, non-targeted. Everybody at the campaign gets the free meal. Everyone along the street gets the money gun shot in their direction, right? Everybody in the neighborhood gets the t-shirt, right? The goal is to build a candidate's brand by distributing these types of handouts as widely as possible. And so you can think about it more as a sort of a particularistic form of advertising, right? Everybody's getting this, there's no sort of moral or ethical obligation the voters feel when they get these things, and candidates don't expect them to feel that. They just hope to raise the recognition and signal that they're in the race. Another one of these, another version of this is credibility buying, where you're actually targeting presumed supporters, but you want to signal your viability as a candidate. So not everybody's getting stuff. You're targeting some and not others, but you're trying to send a signal that you are serious and capable. So think of these payments as the entry price, the ticket for admission. If you want to be a serious candidate and you want your brokers to treat you seriously and the voters to treat you seriously, this is the price of admission. You have to do this. And so voters and candidates are in effect caught in a prisoner's dilemma. They would like not to do this, but if they're the only ones who don't do this, then their life as a candidate will not be a pleasant one. And we got all kinds of quotes that go along with this. I'll just give you a couple here. This is from a broker in Indonesia. If you don't have money, you can't stand. So the minimum a candidate needs to do is provide pocket money, sir. That's all. And then this is from a voter in the Philippines. The election is harvest time for us, so we take advantage of blessings as much as we can. So that you do this, even if you'd rather not do this, if you don't do this, you're not viable, right? People don't take you seriously, and we can count on one hand the number of candidates who didn't engage in these practices that we engaged with. We did manage to find one, quite unfortunately. We can talk about it later, but anyway. And then we have turf protection is the third sort of strategy here, and that's where where we question the presumption that these relationships are sort of stable and binding over time. What we find actually is that candidates fear that even their so-called loyalists, so they talk about, oh, this is my core, this is my loyal, this is my base. But when we actually push them a little bit, they all sort of cop to the idea that their base, their loyalists are actually quite fickle and prone to defection. That ongoing clientelist relationships notwithstanding, that they have to be shot, sometimes the language, shot with funds to sort of tie them and bind their loyalty and actually keep them loyal. If not, they're likely to stray. So these are contingent loyalists at best. And again, we have some great quotes along these lines. Voters can get cash. If voters get cash incentives for electoral support from one candidate, they'll vote. If they don't get it from one, they'll vote for the opponent who gives a better offer. It's a real competition. We give them money just to bind them so they're not pursued by others, but it's like herding goats into a holding pen. You can be sure some will run off tempted by the grass over there. And probably our favorite quote of the whole project: blood is thicker than water, but money, especially if it's a bundle of 1,000 pesos, is much thicker than blood. So I will stop there and turn it over to Meredith.
So I will try to go quickly because we're low on time now. But last type of particularism, also mesoparticularism, also often called pork or pub goods or local public goods, and this involves distribution of patronage to groups and communities. This can be either geographic or group targeting. So it can be a village, or it can be a neighborhood association, or it can be a thank you. I was wondering where that went. Or it can be an ethnic group or something like that. And we see this type of patronage, this type of particularism in all of our cases. It's very popular. It's less expensive than distributing cash or other individual patronage. So it's a way to target a lot of voters at once, even if it's a less deeply felt sort of targeting. It carries less social and legal stigma. So this is something you can brag about. You may not always call your building the Pork Barrel Building, but it might have your name on it. You can put up posters promising these things. It's perfectly legal. It's a done thing. It allows politicians also to provide benefits to voters throughout the electoral cycle, which is why we see so much of this in places like Malaysia, where you have this not just electoral, but more relational long-term clientelism. And it promotes efficient monitoring by focusing on groups of voters rather than individuals. The assumption is of a block vote. That doesn't always happen, but that's the presumed premise. Okay, so what does this really intend to achieve? So parallel to our argument about microparticularism, mesoparticularism is usually not contingent. We argue instead that it's really only plausibly contingent where there are representatives who can speak authoritatively for a community or a social network. So candidates then distribute collective patronage, banking on the capacity of some group representative to be an effective broker, that they'll deliver a block of votes from a network in exchange for their gift. So we find that this works either where there's a close-knit, let's say a Fisher Persons Association or a Longhouse or some other community like that, where one person really can help to control access to those voters or control the way that they vote. Okay, but we find that this is I'll come back that there's been a transition from what we call networks of affect to networks of benefit. So networks of affect are oriented around religious or cultural or other social groups, whereas networks of benefit are those that are more usually tied to income generation or to employment or other material needs. So things like farmers cooperatives or taxi drivers associations or other things. So while we do find plenty of candidates who target networks of affect, giving money to a mosque, for instance, and the people therein, that rather we're finding more attention now to networks of benefit, which are the benefits for, let's say, irrigation materials for a farmers cooperative, because then there's more of a concrete need. And those networks increasingly rely on government officials, particularly at the local level, to channel those sorts of things that they need. So we'll find, for instance, mayors and barangay captains in the Philippines, or village heads or ward chiefs, neighborhood associations like the RT Airway in Indonesia, and then local party service center staff in Malaysia, as well as like party appointed local councilors there or some candidates. This type of patronage also serves to mobilize voters, but with different patterns across countries. We do find a common theme, though, that the confidence that candidates place is frequently misplaced. So there are fewer and fewer reliable vote banks. Yes, there are some farmers who need the irrigation materials, but they may not see this as tied to the candidate. You need to have group cohesion and clear social hierarchy. And development and modernization tend to erode the tightness of the communities that lend themselves well to this sort of targeting. And we'll come back to that in a few slides. All right, so this is just an example of an effort at mesoparticularism. This is from Central Kalimantan. This is a candidate who happily showed us this thing in which he's promising irrigation supplies and things like this, targeting a specific set of local community groups, and then projecting how many votes he'll get from each of those different gifts. All right, lastly, we have macroparticularism, which we also call hijacking. So in principle, it is possible to distinguish between programmatic politics and patronage targeted at groups or individuals, but in practice, that line is often quite blurred. We're looking really at a continuum from more programmatic to less programmatic. So, and this is because parties and candidates aggressively and creatively work to hijack or co-opt programmatic policies in order either to turn them into more targetable and contingent benefits, or just to make them look like they are, to make voters believe that that benefit is tied to the specific candidate or party. So the goal is to spin the benefits of a given programmatic policy to the advantage of a particular candidate or party or politician. That happens even when allocation decisions really are centralized and neutral, but this is something that candidates can really work hard to try to do, to suggest that their personal or partisan intervention and discretion made a difference on a continuum from fully particularistic to fully programmatic. So we are approaching the latter end here, but there's some variation within where we are in that continuum. So what we're looking at is where the extent of discretion over a credit claiming there really tapers off, however much politicians pretend otherwise. So from the voter's perspective, a programmatic policy appears particularistic or partisan. In reality, it may not be, but there's then imputed contingency. You work to convince voters that provision of that benefit, in Singapore, access to housing development board flats, for instance, is contingent on your action. If you don't vote for the PAP, those houses are just going to go away, right? And so that there seems to be then that contingency that my vote gets that party, gets that good. So we identify 3 different forms of hijacking. And they're distinguished by the degree and type of discretion at the point of distribution. Credit claiming over there on the far right, my right, occurs when politicians and parties alter the character or appearance of a programmatic initiative by trying to claim credit for providing it, and to a specific beneficiary generally. So it's not just that they've been instrumental in its passage. That's the basic stuff of politicking, of taking credit for what you've done, but rather by suggesting that there's a policy that that voter gets because of that candidate. So for instance, Malaysian politicians, until the rules were changed, because this really does look rather bad, they required that constituents collect their unconditional cash transfer checks, this program called BRIM, from a party office or from legislators themselves. There's a ceremony, you stand in front of a BN, you have Bangsa Nasional backdrop, you collect a check. The check is from the state, it's not from the politician, but it doesn't look that way. Okay, so it looks like there's intervention involved. The next category is facilitation. This involves connecting individuals or groups with resources that they are qualified for under neutral criteria, but which they might have some trouble accessing. So there is some value added here. There's a form of constituency service, for instance, in helping citizens apply for welfare benefits. Singapore politicians, especially from the PAP, they really excel at this. Again, these are state provided benefits, but it may help to have someone just fill out the paperwork for you. Okay, third, this is where there's a little bit more discretion still. This is morsalization, and this involves carving up public projects or programs so they're produced and distributed according to political rather than economic or programmatic criteria. This effectively turns a programmatic good into meso or micro particularism. We had some trouble trying to figure out how to work with this one. There is actual discretion involved. So for instance, this is when you have a broad block of funding for education funding that's turned into scholarships that politicians hand out and build great loyalty by doing. So how do these play out across our cases? In Malaysia, where parties have been relatively strong and the ruling coalition has unfettered access to the state, hijacking has taken the form of party-focused credit claiming, which favors the ruling party, and facilitation, in which both opposition and governing parties engage. And we see both in our secondary case of Singapore as well. By contrast, in Indonesia, where parties are weak and legislators have less discretion over distribution of resources, the opportunities to claim credit are pretty limited. So they attempt to do so, but where they can, they instead facilitate access to state-provided benefits. And there's not a lot of morsalization. Philippines, different still. So with weak national parties, strong local political machines, and a lot of discretion to influence the provision of public benefits, candidates in the Philippines are more likely to morselize programmatic benefits, but they also engage in both personal and machine-focused credit claiming and facilitation. All right, moving on from those, part of what we find here is that patronage works through and adapts to the range of social divisions. There are a variety of forms here. So we find, for instance, things like prayer mats and headscarves, or rosaries and Bibles that both serve to domesticate religious difference by co-opt. You'll find the same politician who goes to mosques and to churches and appeals with very parallel types of patronage to both. That would be micro-particularism. But the underlying patterns of patronage remain the same, even when you're targeting really different types of groups. So this similarity of function and structure offers to capture more votes using offers or promises of patronage to the full gamut of groups. Okay, we do find evidence of bonding appeals, if you think of bridging and bonding, that trade on group identity. But at the same time, patronage generally subsumes and even domesticates the politics of identity, particularly where electoral systems encourage broadly inclusive strategies. You can't just appeal to this category of voters, you need to appeal more broadly. So patronage distribution then will regularly cross identity group boundaries and tends to bridge divides, even if it promotes deeper within group bonding. So everyone in the mosque gets these goods, they feel very much a unit, but at the same time, that same candidate's also going to the church across the street. Okay, we find that gender falls into the same pattern. Matronage looks very much the same as patronage. There might be somewhat different gifts, there might be different networks involved, but the character of the exchanges and what they're supposed to do is pretty much the same. The only thing we find to be different in terms of these patterns is class. So patterns of patronage distribution, usually through clientelist networks, tend toward hierarchy. So patronage then transcends class and tends to atomize voters who might otherwise form a class block. So patronage wielding politicians don't really address poor voters as a class to be mobilized as such, nor do they seek to bond recipients around a class-defined identity in the same way as they might for other identity categories. Within each of our cases, we've outlined these broad country level patterns, but in each we also find important areas of subnational variation or islands of exception. And these are at two extremes. First is where locales where politicians rely more intensely on patronage, often combining it with coercion. And the second are generally urban areas where programmatic appeals supplement or even supplant patronage. So the first, the islands of exception where we find more patronage, often with coercion, we find that it happens with a few different criteria. One, concentration of control over economic resources. So it's not just underdevelopment, it's the nature of that development. So when economic development occurs in a way that produces local monopolies, for instance, around mining or plantations or resource-focused industries, that tends to empower politically economic elites who control the industry without strengthening the mass of voters. So we end up often in Southeast Asia with then a form of bossism and elite political capture. So this reinforces clientelism and increases the tendency toward coercion. Second factor that matters here is the capacity of local state institutions, where state institutions are pretty well developed, where the state's central organization is efficient, sufficiently autonomous, that local bosses can't really encroach, and where its monopoly over coercion is pretty strong. Politicians have limited ability or impetus to reach much beyond programmatic and clientelist strategies toward coercion. But where the state is weak, programmatic politics may not be possible or might not be credible, and where it's very weak, patronage may go hand in hand with coercion. So for instance, if local bosses with coercive resources supplement or replace handouts with or club good strategies with thuggery, that would be one island of exception. The third factor here has to do with the relative autonomy and egalitarianism of social networks. So where local leaders are sufficiently powerful to direct the political behavior of their subordinates without having to offer an immediate benefit in exchange. So in other words, they can command a block vote and they don't have to share the patronage to do it. They can just tell you, vote this way. Then they are frequently themselves incorporated into local political networks in ways that don't require them to share the benefits with their voters. The critical issue then is the relative density of civil society and the extent to which local community members choose among networks or are tied to a single option. So this is where we find that underdevelopment or developed specifically around natural resource monopolies to play an especially key role. So places like Papua or Mindanao, for instance, or parts of East Malaysia. Okay, so here the relationship may be more obligatory than voluntary, and clients have very little leverage to ensure that patrons distribute the benefits of patronage widely. So these sorts of regions, economic underdevelopment, natural resource endowment, state weakness, strong hierarchical social networks, these all tend to give rise to patterns that are more intensely clientelistic, often with more coercion. By contrast, regions with relatively developed and diversified local economies, robust state capacity, dense and egalitarian local civil societies, here we have more fertile ground for alternatives to patronage, for programmatic policies. And we do find then that diverse cities across our countries tend to be the engines of these new forms of programmatic politics. So places like Penang in Malaysia, Surabaya in Indonesia, Naga City in the Philippines. So this is our last slide, I promise. Okay, our framework does not explain everything, so we would like it to, sadly. For instance, that coup, we can't explain it, not our fault. Okay. Next, our 3 electoral mobilization regimes. These are neither unique nor exhaustive. So other countries may fit the same patterns, or they may suggest additional patterns. Our goal is to present a framework and a method, and we welcome discussion on these points in the little time we've left remaining. So there may be other electoral mobilization regimes or other countries that fit these types. So for instance, we find party-based regimes in Timor-Leste, in Singapore, in Japan, in Turkey, and Mexico. Local machines also in Thailand, much like we find in the Philippines. And these ad hoc networks like in Indonesia, we also find in Peru and Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and be happy to hear of where else. Okay. Second, there is a normative aspect to our research. We do have a preference for more free and fair elections, for more inclusivity rather than exclusivity, and so forth. But at the same time, we recognize that policy remedies are tough. Sadly, there's no easy answer. There are no quick fixes. So reforms are difficult in practice. They may be actually counterproductive when they're implemented. And there can be all sorts of unintended consequences. So electoral reform is one obvious route, for instance, working to strengthen parties, working to strengthen incentives for programmatic appeals, but it doesn't always work as intended. There are other forms of ways of reducing vulnerability. So for instance, the 30 baht healthcare scheme that Thaksin implemented in Thailand is a way of perhaps reducing the reliance on generous patrons. The Bolsa Familia scheme in Brazil has that same sort of goal. There can be bureaucratic reform to reduce or reform discretion. So removing politicians as intermediaries and making it more difficult for them to pretend to be intermediaries when they're not really doing much. And then we have these more commonly tried things like anti-vote buying campaigns. We find those generally not effective. We don't recommend those. They raise issues of, that there really isn't a lot of social stigma to vote buying, as these campaigns assume. They may backfire. They smack of elitism. There's a patronizing attitudes toward poor voters. If only they were better informed, they would vote like I do. So all told, pretty hard to change these patterns, but possible. I'll end there.
That was absolutely marvelous, you guys, as expected. Let me assume my prerogative and ask one question, or open things up before we go to the crowd, both on Zoom and in person. So there are so many ways to think about variation, and there's so much variation that you capture in this project. And so I'm kind of struck by some of the choices that you made on where to focus. And I think it's partly a function of where you each came to the project from. So one could imagine you had this slide on islands of exception, right? You could imagine a different book that would actually make those islands of exception actually the dimensions of variation in how patronage and clientelism work more broadly. So there are lots of possibilities here. It seems to me you're mostly focusing on cross-case variation, and that you're primarily interested in how patronage and clientelism are organized and at what level. Like those seem to be kind of the driving variations for you guys. But I want to just sort of raise two other forms of variation that you didn't focus on, and I'd be curious and just offer some intuitions on those and get your reaction to on those. So one is until almost the very end, the word urban and rural never came up. My intuition would be that the variation between how these things work in urban and rural Indonesia and urban and rural Philippines would be greater than the variation between Indonesia and the Philippines. That would be my intuition. That might not be true, but I'm wondering if what you witnessed would give any credence to that. And also another way to think about variation is where, and you can just get a little bit to the normative point and the outcomes point. So where are voters getting the biggest payoffs, like getting the biggest rewards from these exchanges? And where are they kind of suffering from more or less what Sue Stokes would call perverse accountability, or what Beatrice Magaloni would call a punishment regime, right? And my intuition here would be that in Malaysia and Singapore, you get both the best and the worst, in the sense that actually what these exchanges give you is more in terms of public goods. The payoffs of actually sticking with the PAP, sticking with the BN will get you bigger payoffs than you get in Indonesia or the Philippines, but it involves an enmeshment in a kind of perverse accountability or punishment regime in which your constituency might get denied in a way that maybe isn't the same kind of risk in Indonesia or the Philippines, such that there's kind of and that could be a more, if true, that might be a more general pattern where bigger payoffs, but also bigger punishments. That would be another way of thinking about a scale, and my intuition would look something like that. So that's a lot, but I don't know if anyone has any reactions to that before we other questions.
Reverse accountability.
Okay, and then I'll start on the urban and then we'll move on.
So I think your intuitions aren't wrong there, Dan. One of the things that we were surprised at in most of our cases, speak particularly of Indonesia and the Philippines, is the lack of the sort of perverse accountability story. So voters just, we ask them directly, indirectly, as many ways as we can. They're just not worried about what happens if we don't. Yeah, so they don't feel beholden to politicians. And politicians, when you ask them and the brokers, what if you find out that we know somebody has defected? What do? We can't do anything, right? Yeah. That's the really common story. Where we see exceptions, in addition to what you said, are areas where there's that coercive element as well, right? Where I actually can do something to you, and I will do something to you. So in these areas, these islands of exception, where often violence is also sort of hand in hand with the clientelism. So we were so in most cases, it's not leading to this sort of the challenge is not that voters can no longer hold politicians accountable. The real challenge is other things about efficiency of public goods provision, under provision of those things, voters having politicians having to raise money to do this stuff, but it's not. We've broken the chain of accountability in the way that we kind of worry about in sort of Susan Stowe's world, for example.
In terms of the urban versus rural, this gets me a chance also to say thanks also to Dan and Derek and so forth at the Weiss Center for bringing us here, where we are not only giving this presentation, but have also spent the last couple of days working on precisely this issue about the variations across cities, between and within the different countries we're looking at. So that is our current mega project, is exactly that point, because through the course of this project, we came to realize the extent to which, yes, we can identify these national patterns and we think they make sense. You may not, we're happy to hear that. Well, not happy, but we will hear that. But actually the within country variation can be incredibly stark and makes it, so parts of, Makati will look much more like parts of Kuala Lumpur than other parts of Indonesia or Philippines and Malaysia respectively. And so right now we're looking at the ways in which different types, what we're calling local governance regimes, you can see we like regimes, across different cities relate to delivery of different public goods and services in different ways. And so that is precisely, you were right, Dan, we also found that to be really pretty fascinating. We think so. And so that's what we're working on now. But we don't have answers yet. Soon.
Yeah, just in response to very briefly to both, I mean, anecdotally, I mean, the rural urban thing is certainly very striking. Often when you encounter particular politicians, there was this very memorable politician who was running in the rural district of Rembang in central Java, who said that he'd found it very effective to target the middle class voters who were living in these housing estates in the urban part of his constituency with these letters which were presenting himself as the anti-politik uang, the anti-money politics candidate. He said it was very effective, he's going to do it next time. He found it was very popular. And we said, yeah, but they're only a small minority of the voters here. What about the fishing villages along the edge of the ocean here? He said, oh yeah, I sent them envelopes full of money. So even within particular candidates, you do see these differentiation. But the big macro story, when you look at the survey results, in fact, is that the urban-rural differentiation is actually much less than we expected it to be, right? And I think it's partly to do with the character of the sort of the social ecologies in different sorts of urban settings and different sorts of cities. So the difference between, say, Jakarta and, I don't know, Balikpapan is quite as big as you would expect, say, between some of these sort of urban centres in the middle of rural Java and the surrounding rural periphery. So that's one point. The payoffs versus punishment thing, I think one of those things is the credibility of the threat to punish, right? So, and those big party regimes, like in Singapore and so on, they can really show, or Golkar in the New Order period in Indonesia, right? But nowadays, if you're a voter in Indonesia and, there are just the party map and the sources of authority, the sources of resources so fragmented. If the candidate who'd given you, I don't know, money for a new, I don't know, cow raising cooperative or whatever doesn't get elected and they're angry about you not delivering votes, well, doesn't matter. Next time, there's plenty of other people you can go to for similar sorts of resources. So I think that's a big part of the story, I think.
Yeah, when it comes to the urban versus rural, I guess in the Philippines, the Exhibit A is Makati, the financial capital of the Philippines, where there's not vote buying that one would find in the gated communities, obviously. You'd have to have pretty large resources to make a difference there. But in other areas, there is quite substantial vote buying, and all the more in other parts of Metro Manila that have heavy concentrations of urban poor, whether it be Caloocan or Navotas or the like. So I don't think that we would want to ignore a rural-urban difference. There would be a difference in terms of degree of coercion, the role of the media, and its ability to hold politicians to account. But when it comes to vote buying, you find it across a lot of other settings. In terms of looking at benefits to voters, I would just highlight, we do say that we have a normative element to this, and we do want to see higher quality of democracy. And anytime there is that vote buying, that exchange of cash at election time, it ultimately undermines the social contract of democracy. When a voter has already gotten a payment, it's harder to come back and say, oh, I'd like some policy changes in regard to education or health or the like. So we do end the book by saying that ultimately our objective was to think about ways in which we can provide analysis to those who are seeking to improve the quality of democracy. At certain points, admittedly, throughout, we kind of felt like maybe we're doing a manual of patronage politics on how to do all of these things, as Alan showed. But our ultimate objective was to provide some analysis to those who are trying to bring about higher quality of democracy.
Thanks, that's great.
Pilot?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Like your existence here is like very cherish this opportunity to raise questions, and then I already like raised two biggest questions that linger in my head. So like so since Dan already asked about like variation, I want to ask about sustainability. So like I want to know like how patronage is sustained in a longer time horizon. So for example, I'm thinking about two types of sustainability. So one is like sustainability within a candidate. I mean, especially in the case of Indonesia, like since the party and the candidates tend to have like less access to state resources, like how they manage to like generate resources and money that will sustain them throughout like different elections. And it is quite counterintuitive that they dissolve the network like once after they like win the election. It sounds like a little bit counterintuitive to me. Another thing is like the sustainability across different candidates. So I'm wondering, like, of course, like the House of Representatives in Philippines have term limits, but Malaysia and Indonesia don't have term limits for the parliament members. So like, but they will still retire. I mean, how do they manage to like pass on their networks to their successors in the future without like affecting the networks and maintain their credibility like over time? So that's the question in my head.
Why don't we start with Indonesia?
Sure, thanks for the question. Yeah, so the way if a candidate who has, so often the typical pattern, this is sort of a very typical pattern in Indonesia, that the candidate will run for office, and they'll often do so by investing their personal resources. So that could mean, depending on what level they're running, the nature of their family background and so on, they could like sell off land or sell off investments, mortgage their house very often, that sort of thing, or they will seek sponsorship from private business. So they build up these debts going into the elections. If they lose, that can be very problematic. And then you get these sort of typical reports after Indonesian elections of politicians committing suicide or being, experiencing sort of mental health problems and so on as a result of that. If they do get elected, however, the typical way they recoup their investments is through corruption. So they don't have so much access to state resources in the form of patronage that they can distribute to reward their supporters, but typically the payoff comes in terms of skimming from the budget or rewarding the financial sponsors they had typically. So it then becomes a matter of clientelism and corruption becoming sort of being distinct phenomena, but obviously being very closely interrelated. It can be very risky for such politicians as a result. At the sort of a system level, I would say that these systems partly become sustained because there are just these massive collective action problems for politicians who want to exit from them, right? So we we probably lost count of the number of times of candidates we encountered in the field who said, you know, I really hate this system. I wish I didn't have to do it. It's risky. You know, I could lose face with my family. I could lose a lot of the money they've invested in me. And yet they felt that because other candidates were doing the same, because these practices have become normalized among voters, that they had little choice but to engage. So the problems of coordination are really massive for politicians in a system like Indonesia to exit from that system.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I just meant on the sustaining over time. So part of this is the function of these regime types. So in Malaysia, these networks are embedded within parties that are bigger than and outlast candidates. Right. In the Philippines, despite the term limits, these local machines often are often built by one candidate, but extend to that candidate's family and allies. And so those machines can outlast a candidate who will step down as mayor, run as governor or vice mayor, or another family member step in. So these are enduring. While in Indonesia, harder to sustain these things because there isn't that kind of in between elections, those kinds of machinery. But that is, to your point, in part because there's just fewer resources to maintain those machines for Indonesian politicians, right? They just don't have the access to state resources to be able to build and then maintain these things in between elections.
At the same time, so talking about the sustaining between elections. So Malaysia, if you're on the government side, you have resources between elections. If you're not, you don't have those resources. But if you want to win, you go often years in advance, you set up a service center and you start providing services for the constituents in the area. Or if you lost in the last election, you keep the service center alive. You pay out of pocket, you fundraise. These are the sorts of features that tend to encourage not just a sort of dynastic politics where you have a family support. Nurliza Anwar's daughter lost her seat. That's dynastic politics. That's not always enough, but rather it also privileges wealthier candidates. So you find these very idealistic people in Malaysia who think they want to run for office and they could do a great job, but they just don't have the resources. Because even if you're on the government side, there's a lot of spending out of pocket that happens, and definitely if you're not. And so that's a more relational pattern that we have, meaning it's a less episodic, less targeted to the elections than we have elsewhere, but it does suggest part of why this ends up being sustainable. And it's linked to parties, but there's also an important portion of the vote that's a personal vote in Malaysia, where, as we know, if you know anything about Malaysian politics, is that it's really messy, right? And so a part of that is just the extent to which vote margins are getting quite narrow. So the little bit of personal vote you get can really tip the scales.
I'll just say one more thing. First of all, thanks for the question with its two prongs. On that first prong about sustainability in terms of resources, the other thing to note that hasn't been mentioned yet is the common importance of illicit sources of income. And remember, at the outset, we speak of patronage generally, but not always from public sources. And so a politician, particularly if you're in the opposition, you're trying to get in, there can be a strong temptation to get into illicit economic activities, whether it be gun running or smuggling or drugs or prostitution. And then, of course, once you have some foothold on public power, you might also enjoy a bit of impunity because you know the right people, so you don't get prosecuted for these things. So that can be a means of sustaining patronage networks. And then in terms of passing it along, as Alan has said, we can think along continuum of in terms of institutionalization of networks, of Malaysia being most institutionalized, the Philippines being the intermediate case, and then Indonesia the least enduring. And in the Philippines, the possibility coming out of the term limit system of these networks going from father to daughter to a mother to son, and you've got this family network that can be picked up. So you have much lower entry costs to getting into politics if you come from a political family like that.
Yeah. Oh,
question. Why don't we gather like three?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'll touch brief. First of all, thank you for all the presentation, and it's really excited to see you all here. My question is related to like the cross-case variation in like parties' relationship with like civil society organizing. organization. So I think it's kind of peppered throughout the discussion about like how like parties donate or interact with like religious leaders or neighborhood organization. But I just want to hear a little bit more about like how much do these cases vary in terms of like how like these, for example, like religious leaders are infused within the like party machines, for example, like cases like Indonesia, like how religious leaders like helping these like candidates mobilize votes or like donate these resources to voters, and also like maybe this would also be discussed in relation to cases outside your primary cases, like for example, Burma, like one party is pretty much tied to the military, and all these patronage resources come from the military. Or if we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, like we talk about the important role of village chiefs. So I just want to hear a little bit more about like how they are all tied together and like how they vary between Malaysia and Indonesia, or for example.
Take a few more before we Lasha.
I'm curious about the role of media. I wonder if you ever witnessed, like as you follow the candidates and the campaigns, how did the media project and broadcasted this source of patronage relationships? And is it something they keep out of sight, or is it so normal that everybody talks about it or even expects it to happen? I also wonder if you had any access about people's perceptions about this kind of relationships. Do the voters see this as a corrupt relationship as social scientists do, or is this just, the way it is?
Ken? Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I'm just wondering a little bit about the other Southeast Asian cases you didn't get to touch upon. I know it wasn't in the study, but I was wondering if you could speculate a little bit about what you thought about, say, in the other cases, such as, say, of Southeast Asian states with elections or past tense elections, such as, say, Myanmar or Cambodia, given, your theory on how historical determinants help explain the different variations in the electoral mobilization regimes. What sort of vote buying patterns would you expect in Myanmar and Cambodia? Thank you. Let's keep going, get a couple more, and then give you guys a few minutes to respond. Jamsil.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I guess my question is more about like a historical perspective of patron-client relationships. I think Aspinall has a little bit of talk about this issue, but I want can you like talk more about like how does like the different authoritarian legacy across the countries shapes different kind of like patron-client relationship in these case studies? Because I think that I'm curious about like how does like Indonesian experience where like there are like 30 years of authoritarian rules where the dictators use like Golkar as the patron-client regimes, and then it shapes how like some regions like has like political dynasty that well coming from that authoritarian legacy. It's just like do you find like a similar or different patterns across these countries?
Yeah, last question, Helen.
So I kind of like had this general question about party or electoral mobilization and state institutions. Oh, in the presentation, it sounds like with the case of the Philippines and Indonesia, you have, if you like have a weaker or pragmatic state from the onset, then it's more likely to see like stronger like patronage or clientelism kind of mobilization. I wonder the opposite of like with as your observation on the past few elections, with stronger mobilizing, what are the impact? To what degree they shape the state institution, how the state distribute resources, and what are the conditions that we should take into consideration? Thank you.
So we want to take about a couple minutes each in whatever order you wish to go, and lots to respond to, but
Great. A set of very good questions, and thank you to all. I'll just take a stab at each of them and allow my colleagues to pick it up. In terms of the role of religious leaders and more broadly looking at party civil society relations, of course, parties are very, your question? Oh, yeah. Parties are very weak in the Philippines, of course, but we still found roles for religious leaders. It's most evident with the church that has the greatest discipline over its members, and this is Iglesia Ni Cristo. And at the beginning of every election, there is an effort by candidates to get their support, because then they get a major chunk of votes from a quite secure vote bank. Let me also add an anecdote. Among the very interesting things that we encountered in the midst of our research was sitting in a churchyard of an evangelical preacher who was part of an effort to unseat a longstanding dynasty. And he sat and explained to us the mechanisms of vote buying. So for him, it was a righteous cause. Secondly, on the question of media, I'd start with a distinction that's common in the Philippines between an air war and a ground war. And the air war is the focus on traditionally on television and radio. And the ground war is the way in which, particularly for local races, and it can be up to congressional races as well, where there is a concerted effort to get resources out, whether it be in the form of vote buying at election time, or patronage jobs, or morsalized scholarship programs, healthcare benefits, and things like that. Now, into the air war, there is this very important new innovation of social media. And in 2016, we kind of thought that we had the keys to the kingdom. We were really providing the explanation for how voters work. And then out of right field comes social media effort of Duterte. So that is among those things that we realize it's not our major focus, but we are fully aware of how this has changed the calculus. I'll take one other chunk from the other three, the next two questions, and that is the relevance of an analysis of patronage politics in authoritarian settings. And you can see this most recently, perhaps in the Thailand 2019 elections, where the regime was actively engaged in money politics, but then it was arresting the opposition if they were trying to give out money. So money politics can be alive and well in authoritarian settings. And we could find that someone mentioned Cambodia. Under Hun Sen, surely there is a significant degree of patronage in those authoritarian settings. And then on the historical questions, historically under both Suharto and Marcos, both regimes, authoritarian, relied very heavily on patronage mechanisms as well. And the final questions on parties and states just sort of highlight how our focus in the historical institutional chapter is how you have constituencies for patronage that develop in three different settings, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and Malaysia, but out of very different sorts of historical foundations. So to put it very briefly, the Philippines accords to what you expect from Schefter, and the other two go in some different directions, but I know Dan is a fellow fan of Schefter as well. Certainly, Schefter was not anticipating the convulsion of the shift from colonial to post-colonial world. So that something that we note in the way that Malaysia and Indonesia do not fit that pattern of where you have a well-developed bureaucracy. It should be enduring into the future. It was a major fissure at that point.
I won't try and address all the questions, just one or two of them briefly. Relationship between party and civil society, particularly religious organizations. In the Indonesian case, it makes sense to think of the world of politics and political parties and candidates and the world of civil society organizations, religious bodies and the like as sort of running in parallel, and at election times, there's just this mass of crisscrossing connections, bargaining, negotiation. There are some sort of patterns. So for example, Nahdlatul Ulama, the main traditionalist Islamic organization, is generally associated with one particular party, PKB, but even that is far from being a standardized pattern. If you go down to these areas where Nahdlatul Ulama is strong in Central or East Java, you'll find multiple candidates targeting multiple NU organizations and communities. So there's just this massive, dizzying world of sort of cross-cutting connections. any sort of grassroots religious organization, like this very popular form of devotional activity in Indonesia, much of this taklim, these sort of community devotional groups, they'll often just get targeted by multiple candidates at election time with different sorts of offers. So it's just, yeah, very, very complex. Other Southeast Asian cases, I mean, one which is a really fascinating contrast with Indonesia in particular is Timor-Leste. And it's a great example actually of the difference that an electoral system can make. I mean, there's obviously a different history of state and party formation and all the rest of it, but one critical distinction there is that Timor-Leste retained the system of closed list proportional representation, which means that voters choose only a party as well as, rather than a party or an individual candidate as they do in Indonesia. And the result is if their elections were simultaneously, if you cross the border from Indonesian to West Timor to East Timor election, you just see this dramatic shift the moment you cross the border. Much less individualized vote buying and distribution in Timor-Leste, much more party-focused campaigning, much higher emphasis on party symbols and programs. The media question, look, let's not go into that too much. I think one of the things that is that many, certainly in Indonesia, the Philippines, a lot of these activities are sort of, they might be formally legal, but they're sort of socially licit. So a lot of journalists just don't even bother reporting on them. I recall a candidate, a Golkar candidate in Central Java, who there'd been an expose of her in the media that on a local television station, that someone had found all these envelopes with money in them that she'd been distributing. And I interviewed her after the election. She's telling me about this. She's really angry. And I thought at first she was angry because it was exposure. She might get in trouble. And she said, no, they showed that I only had 10,000 rupiah in these envelopes. I was distributing 20,000. Those bastards was trying to say I was stingy. Anyway, sorry.
There you go. I'll just two things, some great questions. On the sort of civil society stuff, let me just reemphasize the point that we made very quickly in the presentation. One of the things going into this, we kind of expected religious groups, ethnic groups, things like that, to be competitors to or alternative sort of networks of mobilization, either within party frameworks or alongside party frameworks or candidate mobilization frameworks. And we really didn't find that, right? So these get incorporated into these patronage machines, and the patronage machine adapts to the needs of that network, but they really didn't serve as sort of alternative foci for mobilization in ways that we had sort of anticipated going in. You know, you'd have candidates who'd mobilize based on ethnic appeals or on, but really not, at least in Philippines and Thailand particularly. And then on the media, just to pick on the point you asked about whether or not this is accepted by participants, and the answer is just yes, right? You know, people will express, yeah, it'd be better if it wasn't this way, but if it is this way, I want to be sure I get mine, right? This is the opportunity for massive redistribution, right? That comes every electoral calendar, every time that rolls around, and so voters are sort of in line to get theirs and expect them to get theirs, and there really isn't any sort of widely recognized. Everybody, everybody's participating, and people in fact get angrier when they are left out than when they're targeted, right?
Okay, so I'll just pick up again on a few things. So a different point about the relationship with civil society. In Malaysia, this is different because they're more stable parties. Parties help to make up for the lack of access to state resources. Civil society organizations help to make up for the lack of access to state resources. So groups like Bersih, for instance. In Singapore, that would be the case, except those links are explicitly disallowed. And it's partly in law, partly in norm. And if you're interested in that point, I can recommend a different book on that called Roots of Resilience. Okay. In terms of the role of the media, I actually think that there's a bit of a shift here over time. The most recent Malaysian election, the rise of social media, I think, is actually privileging mesoparticularism in new ways. So for instance, my best anecdote on this is I was in Johor in the constituency of Muhyiddin Yassin, the head of Bersatu, former short-term prime minister, now arrested. for all this money that he was spending. Where did it come from? At any rate, so one of his campaign manager was talking about that their contestant in the area was from Muda, this sort of youth upstart party, and had been giving out iPads and all, and food, and food for flood aid and all that. So his campaign manager pulls out his phone, pulls up a TikTok video. And it was so masterfully done. It was a flood aid, dramatic music. They had shipping containers full of food and with a curtain instead of the wall along one side, so they could draw it back and show this is what generosity looks like. So that's mesoparticularism, but also helped with the campaign and relied upon the surge of TikTok campaigning. Depends on people's takes on relationships, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, but I think also elsewhere, like Philippines, we have these godparent relationships. Often this is framed as being part of like zakat in Indonesia or Malaysia, the sort of social obligation. It's just what it's sort of a very religious framing. In fact, we heard from one Golkar politician in Indonesia, another framing of the word air war as being when you put the angels against each other, you have different praying circles who are fighting for you. And he used the term air war for that. But then also, for instance, a fun anecdote from a candidate, a BN staffer, basically a speechwriter in Sarawak, who said that nobody's going to trust a politician in a Proton, Malaysian made car. Like, you want someone who's got some money that you can rely on if you need it. Right, exactly. So in other words, this idea of like, this is part of an established social relationship. The last thing I'll say will be just in terms of the weak state, strong state, whether we should expect less clientelism. So yeah, I mean, strong states, the work of Kanchan Chandra in India has been really useful for me in thinking through this in Malaysia, where you have over 70% urbanization. When you have disrupted those local connections, those patron-client ties that existed in more rural areas through local internal migration, and when people need types of infrastructure that will otherwise be areas of market failure, the private sector won't provide, they need programmatic policies. And so that also requires a level of a strong state to be able to provide functioning public transport, for instance, sewage systems that actually work, and all of those other things. So these things tend to work in tandem.
Well, the theory was fun, the typology is great, the political science is nice, but you really should do a version of this talk just stringing together all your best anecdotes.
Anecdote file.
Absolutely amazing. You're going to do it just for more fun for yourselves too. This is really.
I'll just say that I whispered to Ed, I hadn't heard that anecdote yet, right? And I hadn't heard the other one about the shipping container. So they just keep getting generated.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out. This is great. And thanks everyone for coming out.
Thanks for the question. Thank you.
Thanks so much.